The original conception of the first sequel to the hit film Star Wars was a work that would serve the basis of the novel Splinter of the Mind's Eye, conceived on the assumption that the sequel would have a smaller budget and might not have Harrison Ford to play Han Solo. The unprecedented success of Star Wars demanded a much more ambitious film, and George Lucas originally approached Lee Brackett for her skill both as a writer of science fiction and a writer of several classic films. But Lucas wasn't happy with the results that came from their story meetings, and with Brackett's poor health and a ticking clock, Lucas was forced to begin writing it himself. It was during this time that he realized the stumbling block of the film, and corrected it, by combining the redundant character of Anakin Skywalker with the villainous Darth Vader. Lawrence Kasdan, who had completed the script for Raiders of the Lost Ark, was hired to take Lucas's script and create one based upon that. The result was a film that is frequently listed as the best of the series. This despite the fact the film operates overall at a slower pace and explores mystical philosophy more than its predecessor. This is not meant to be a complete analysis of the film by any means. Rather, it's a consideration of some of the ideas that arise by looking at its storytelling, without the need to explore every single aspect of it, and to also look at other works that might provide some kind of insights into what The Empire Strikes Back does and how it does it well. You can think of this collection of essays less of a book about Star Wars and more of me as your friend by the fireplace sharing some thoughts over a brandy as we muse about what comes to mind after watching this film. In order to appreciate the significance of the combination of Anakin with Vader, we need to first consider complex versus complicated, especially when it comes to storytelling. The difference there isn't quite as obvious as when you take simple versus complex. Complicated versus complex might seem at first just a semantics thing, that they're pretty much the same thing. What we have to understand is that complicated is actually a bunch of simple items altogether. Once you realize that it becomes much more obvious. It's the difference between a full-sized man and a bunch of children piled up inside of a trench coat. Complicated uses many simple things to attempt to appear complex. This is recognized in business. It is much, much better to have a complicated problem than to have a complex one, because a complicated problem is merely a collection of simple problems, and simple problems can be solved. But complex problems usually can't be solved. They can only be managed. There are just too many factors to them in order to be able to create a long-term solution. To illustrate complex in action, I'm going to head off on a tangent for a little while with a video game called Contradiction. Now, this is a full-motion video game, a detective story told using classic adventure game techniques. There's a murder mystery in this English village, and you search for evidence and question people looking for contradictions in their story. This game was crowdfunded, and it is amazing they were able to get the late great Paul Darrow to appear in it. But one consequence was that the game's old-style adventure game rules were in contrast to the realism that FMV implies by the presence of living, breathing human beings. The middle-aged police detective is investigating a girl's murder, which occurred 1 year after a college student committed suicide in this town. Where the problem lies is that the adventure game character does not behave like a police detective. Some examples of the problems: he doesn't even have the most basic equipment that an officer should have, a flashlight. He has only one evidence bag. And he never interacts with local law enforcement. He doesn't even have a mobile phone. When he contacts his superior, he uses a public payphone. In addition, he engages in behavior that is clearly against police procedures: trespassing, theft, searching locked buildings and vehicles without permission. Again, standard old-school adventure game behavior, completely at odds with how a detective would act, all the more noticeable because FMV increases the sense of realism. Now, this was hand-waved away as something necessary for the game to be a game, but allow me to show you how, thanks to making the detective complex, I can solve every single problem with the game. At the end, when the detective has solved the murder, he does what he's been doing and returns to the old payphone to inform his superior that the case is solved. And as we're listening to the chief discussing the successful outcome of the case, the camera would pan down to reveal the phone cord was cut ages ago. And when that happens, you will suddenly realize this detective is hearing a voice in his own head, and could then follow it up with a scene from the interview with Paul Darrow's character, one that we hadn't been shown previously, where the interviewee suddenly questions why the detective's name isn't listed as being in service to the police, or ever being in service to the police. That the only record of anyone with that name was an investigator for perhaps an insurance company or inland revenue, or perhaps an investigative journalist. Someone else who has been in a mental hospital since his son committed suicide in this town 1 year ago, but who seemed to have escaped upon the murder of that girl on the anniversary of his son's death. This revelation means that now every single item that was dismissed as the limitation of the game being a game has a plausible explanation for it, that the detective isn't a police detective. He's a disturbed man trying to find closure over his son's suicide by trying to solve the murder of this girl. It's not that it would be a plot twist. It would be that it would tie together the suicide, murder, his inexplicable behavior, his lack of proper equipment, his lack of interaction with local authority, and his use of a payphone over a mobile, all unrelated or tangentially related items, now suddenly linking up with this one unexpected revelation. It would, fittingly, give an entirely new meaning to the title. The greatest contradiction of all is the main character, a police detective who does not behave like a police detective, revealed to be nothing of the kind. You see how this has now altered the entire work by this revelation, that the disparate pieces were, in fact, clues to the greater truth. That's why complex is almost always better than complicated in storytelling. The elements have greater meaning now. Consider then how the revelation that Darth Vader is Luke's father changes the relationships between him and the Force-using characters of The Empire Strikes Back. As I explored in the Shadow's journey, this was a decision Lucas reached well into the work on the second film, and was by no means the original plan, but was chosen precisely because it fixed up the story by moving it from complicated to complex. There were 5 other Force users in the original conception: Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, and the Emperor. Each one has a simple relationship with Luke. Luke despises Vader, who killed Obi-Wan and Anakin. Vader pursues Luke to use him as an ally in destroying the Emperor. Luke idolizes his father as a pilot and Jedi. He wants to follow in his footsteps. Anakin wants Luke to pursue the Jedi path. Luke saw Obi-Wan as a mentor, friend, and the last link to the idolized father. Obi-Wan sees Luke as the last hope for the galaxy. Luke is trying to learn to be a Jedi from Yoda. Yoda is reluctant to do so. Luke has no relation with the Emperor personally, merely as the abstract center of Imperial evil. But the Emperor sees Luke as a growing Jedi who could become a threat. But now watch what happens as we keep all of those relationships, save for one, when we merge Anakin Skywalker with Darth Vader, but make sure Luke is the only one unaware of this fact. Luke's relationship with his father is unwittingly in complete contrast with his feelings towards Vader. He loves and worships one while hating and wishing to destroy the other, unaware that they are towards the same man. Now Vader is not just pursuing a weapon to use against the Emperor, but his own son, with all the emotional elements that includes. Obi-Wan not only believes Luke is the galaxy's last hope, It's the closest he will get to redemption by not failing 2 generations of Skywalkers. Yoda's reluctance to train Luke is now given a very valid reason, that Luke is so very much like his father, and training him turned out badly. The Emperor wants to destroy Luke, not just because any Jedi is a threat, but being connected to Vader is a threat to their own master-apprentice power dynamic. So you see how we have gone from complicated to complex. Fewer characters, but more aspects to the relationships in spite of that. One of the interesting paradoxes of complex done well is that by foregoing simplicity, it actually simplifies things. Fewer elements, but each element now means something more. The revelation that Vader is Luke's father isn't just a plot twist. It now allows this entirely new understanding of the pieces to emerge. The big final act of the original film was the battle against the Death Star and the desperate race against the clock that it represented. A big explosive climax to the film. In The Empire Strikes Back, the formula is then deliberately flipped. The big conflict ends the first act, and the final act is, by and large, a conflict between 2 individuals, but also about the remaining main characters who are on Cloud City. Both of these climactic scenarios are very different, yet their effectiveness stems from the same basic effect upon the audience. To see this, contrast the Battle of Yavin with the Battle of Hoth. Not to diminish the latter, because while one was on the ground and the other is in space, both were about attempting to stop the unstoppable, because the rebellion will be destroyed otherwise. Both of these battles are exciting in their own ways, one showing a great triumph despite the odds, the other showing defeat and the need to flee. But what narratively separates the 2 of them is that the Battle of Yavin was the culmination of Luke's character journey of the film, the use of his Jedi training to achieve the impossible, to do what even a computer cannot do. In other words, Luke wasn't just in the battle. This was about everything Luke had been learning, all the ways he had grown from the kid who dreamed of other places to being the one to slay the dragon himself. In contrast, the Battle of Hoth was Luke doing his job as a pilot for the rebellion. Again, not to diminish this, but rather to see how it served a different function. The battle wasn't the film's climax because it wasn't the character's climax. It wasn't about Luke losing his gunner, getting his speeder shot down, or his individual success in defeating an Imperial walker and how that might affect him. Those were things he went through as part of his duty for a cause which he believed in. With that, it's then easy to see why the film's final act is a lightsaber duel between Luke and Darth Vader. Because what the film establishes on Luke's journey throughout Empire is that Luke's need to be a Jedi stems from his father being a Jedi. This is what drives him. When he first took his step on the path towards becoming something more than a farm boy, Luke said he wanted to be a Jedi like my father. When Yoda asks why he must become a Jedi, the same reason is given. This is why the most iconic moment of the film, and arguably the series, is Darth Vader telling Luke that he is the young Jedi's father. It reveals that the man whom he aspires to be and the man he utterly loathes are one and the same. This then shows us the similarity to the climactic battle of the previous film, even though they couldn't have been more different. Both are about the culmination of the character's journey, of what they themselves feel and have learned, and the impact that will have. Both battles are about Luke in the end, while the Battle of Hoth is merely one where Luke happens to be participating. Again, that doesn't diminish the Battle of Hoth, merely shows why it serves as the end of the first third of the film, and not the end of the film itself. As for the other characters escaping Cloud City, this is the smaller culmination of their journey. Lando, of course, atoning for betraying them to the Empire. Chewbacca accepting that he has a new responsibility now, to watching over the princess. And Leia fighting for something personal, rather than what is important for the cause. The event which preceded the conflict was the culmination of Leia's character journey for the film during the carbon freezing scene, where she famously says, "I love you," and Han Solo replies with, "I know." An ad-lib inspired from another film, but nevertheless not only fitting, but actually superior. The relationship between the two begins with Han saying that Leia wants him to stay because of how she feels about him, a view he repeats throughout the film over and over. Her moment in that scene is the culmination because only now, when it's possibly the end, can she bring herself to say it. His response of, "I know," may seem dismissive of the revelation. After all, she has finally confessed what he's been saying the entire film. Doesn't it seem dismissive and lacking in reciprocity? Yet the line says so much more. "I love you too" would merely be an expression of his feelings. "I know" speaks to the level of their connection. It makes clear we don't have time for the words now, but it's all right. We don't need them. I know. I've long known. Think about the Pixar film Up and the montage that transitions from the meek child to the cantankerous old man. We aren't told what has happened to make Carl the way he is, or why he is so protective of his house. We are shown a lifetime together in that house. There's a little bit of them in those walls. Not a single word is spoken. We get it all. We feel it all. The audience cannot help but understand now. We don't hear how much Carl loves Ellie. We see it in every moment they share, in every act of kindness. A screenwriter is tempted to write the poetic lines, to put the old man at the wife's grave, to say what he feels and tug at the heartstrings, but Up works by forgetting the tugging and breaking your heart directly, letting you see a lifetime of love through good times and grief, until the final moment when Carl stands alone. No words are said. They don't need to be. Carl doesn't tell you he's heartbroken. You know. Empire operates on similar principles. Han doesn't say "I love you" because he doesn't need to. That, in the end, is the point. Say "I love you"? I've been saying it every moment I'm with you. "I know," in its minimalism, says everything. You don't need to say a word, my princess. I already know. And by telling you that, you can see you know too. Han Solo, the man for whom actions speak louder than words, sees actions as words. I've told you in 100 tiny ways, I love you. The words won't make them mean anymore. Because you already know. Likewise, this illustrates the reason why the mantra "show, don't tell" exists. Experience is much more powerful when it comes to emotions, because it helps to build empathy between the audience and the character. Obviously, telling is sometimes very important. The most famous line in the film isn't "I know," but rather "I am your father." But that line is memorable because the story invested us in Luke's journey, so that we understood the gravity of it when it arrived. When Luke screams "no," it's not corny, because the audience understands by now, having been with him throughout all of this, how this is attacking his entire sense of identity. Luke doesn't say why he's heartbroken. We know. The mysticism of the film is famous, but it should be noted how much more effective it is through its careful balance. Yoda teaches lessons to Luke, certainly, but these are limited. Much of the time we are shown events without explanation. This differentiates from the previously discussed "I know" and the like, because this isn't about instilling emotions in the audience, but rather to allow the audience to witness the events and thus draw their own conclusions, instead of having the wise mentor interpret them for us. Note that perhaps two of the most significant moments for Luke in the film, when it comes to his growing understanding of the Force, occurs in caves typically being significant in myth and folklore. The first is the Wampa Cave, where Luke is frozen to the ceiling, his means of salvation beyond his reach. There are no words spoken, we merely observe. Luke failing to reach the weapon, then deciding to calm himself and call the lightsaber to him. We can infer that this is the first time Luke has ever done this, because if he had before, it likely would have been his immediate thought, rather than fruitlessly and straining for it. By doing so, we first are showing that Luke has taken his Jedi skills to a new level. This would then likely explain the Emperor contacting Vader to announce that there is a great disturbance in the Force, that suddenly out of nowhere some new player has demonstrated skills they couldn't normally possess. It likely is also the reason that Vader is so certain that Hoth is the location of the Rebel base the moment that he sees the footage. This incident with Luke, occurring so near the start of the film, thus sets up his journey for this film. Last time he took his first step into a larger world, now he is fully arrived in that world, and will it now be on the path of the light with Yoda, or on the path of the dark with Vader? As established, Luke despises Vader, so the latter would seem unlikely, hence the second cave for Luke, the one on Dagobah. We again don't have it interpreted. The most is merely an acknowledgement that Luke failed that test. Despite Yoda's assertions that there was nothing in there but what he took with him, and that there was no need for his lightsaber, Luke went in armed anyway, and confronted an image of Vader, one that he defeated, but clearly with rage in his heart, the look on his face as his lightsaber skids over the weapon of his opponent, and then to see his own face within the mask of his hated enemy. We see how, in trying to vanquish evil, Luke becomes evil, and thus why he can choose to follow the path of the man that he despises. It also serves as a wonderful demonstration of the two sides. In the bright ice cave, Luke uses calm and peace to succeed. In the dark swamp cave, Luke uses anger and hatred to fail. This hands-off approach to the philosophizing thus gives Yoda's explanations all the more significance when they do show up. Yoda offers guidance in small bite-sized pieces reflective of the moment. Thus his speech about what the Force is and how to use it becomes that much more memorable, because Yoda's not pontificating on every single event. Now this requires a lot of faith on the part of the writers and directors, because you need things communicated to the audience without actually communicating. Consider, for instance, Al Pacino's brilliant work in The Godfather, how he has to reveal the changing view of himself as a member of the family business by noticing how steady his own hands are while the baker's hands are trembling. But to then also show us his nervousness when meeting with the Turk and his corrupt police captain bodyguard, while simultaneously trying to be a man who is not being nervous so as not to tip off the other two that something is up here. I mean, this requires putting a lot of trust in both the actors to deliver and the audience to understand what's going on. But this is certainly preferable, making your actual dialogue mean more than, while giving your audience things to think about the rest of the time. It may be hard, given that Star Wars is nearly 45 years old, to see how surprisingly quick the original film ends. The assault on the Death Star is a relentless, adrenaline-filled series of catastrophic deaths, scenes inspired by old war movies to add to the verisimilitude of the attack. Yet recall that once the triumph has occurred and the Death Star is destroyed, very little more is actually said. No speeches are given, no words about the future. There's a celebration of victory. It's open to interpretation as to what is to come. Is the Empire beaten, or is this just one important win that will require far more to actually win the day? We only know for sure that the evil Lord Vader is still out there to menace again, but whether as a leader within the Empire or merely pursuing his own agenda, it's all up to the viewer to decide, at least until the next film were to come along. Where would the sequel go from here? It's all up in the air, so Lucas focuses it upon what we've done rather than where we're going. Now, The Empire Strikes Back is similar in its own way, even though they knew there was going to be another film after this. It doesn't end with a victory, it ends with escape. The short resolution after said escape is to show that, okay, with the exception of Han Solo, they are all right. The rebel fleet is also all right, and we're now taking steps to rescue the man who was not saved. The Empire Strikes Back doesn't celebrate victory, it celebrates that we will live to fight another day. There's no promise given to the audience besides Han Solo, though. The only dialogue is between Luke and Lando, with Chewie's untranslated vocalizations. But things don't always need to be spoken. The viewer can be trusted to understand what's going on here. We can observe and deduce what likely is going through their minds, which is, okay, we've suffered a defeat, but we're not yet beaten. The Empire has struck us. It's now time for us to lick our wounds and prepare when we will vanquish evil for good. This ending does provide us with a satisfying conclusion to a great film. It shows how well it completed its vital job. The film needed to prove the viability of Star Wars in order to support Luke's vision for where he wanted to take films with Skywalker Ranch. Everything was riding on the success of this movie, and despite it being slower, with lower stakes, introspective at times, and in some cases darker than before, it not only showed that Star Wars was capable of being more, but of doing so with even greater sophistication in its storytelling, in all of those aspects. The Empire Strikes Back sought to preserve the space opera that Star Wars was, while providing a poet's heart.